Hello students, welcome again. Students, in today's video lecture, we want to understand the literary characteristics of the poetry which was mainly produced during the period of the age of Geoffrey Chaucer. This period 1350 to 1400, these 50 years is known as the age of Geoffrey Chaucer. Some historians consider this period as the dark epoch. Epoch means the era or the period, right? But it is not 100% correct. Why? Because if you examine the 12th and 13th century, you do not have any literary production. So fine, 12th and 13th century, they can be termed as dark ages, but not the 14th century, because during the 14th century we have a kind of the spirit of revival, which is also known as Renaissance, the beginning of Renaissance, the seeds of Renaissance in England you find during the 14th century. And as a result, lot many changes were taking place here in England during the 14th century. Changes were taking place on social, political, and religious levels. Okay, in the Christianity, so many changes took place in religion, in politics, in the society. The whole social structure was also changing. So this period is also known as the transitional period. Transition means change from one period, from one spirit to the other. Okay, and all these changes are very much visible in some of the major writers or poets of this age. Who were the major poets? As you can see on the screen, the most important poet, the father of English literature, the father of English poetry, Geoffrey Chaucer, who is also popular by his poetry, the Canterbury Tales. Another important poet during this 14th century was John Gower. Okay, John Gower was a moralist poet who wrote Confessio Amantis. William Langland also must be noted here. He is also known by his poetry Piers the Plowman, and John Barber, who has written this epic called Bruce. So these four poets, Chaucer, Gower, Langland, and Barber, they are considered as the most important poets of the 14th century. Apart from these five, we have John Wycliffe, who is also known by his Bible translation. For the first time, it was John Wycliffe who translated Bible from Latin into English. Okay, now the question is, what kind of society was existing in England during the 14th century? So one by one, I am talking about different characteristics of the social, political, and religious structure of England during those times. This 14th century is known as the transitional age. Here, the medieval period. Medieval period means I am talking about the 12th 13th century, which is known as medieval age or middle ages. Okay, this medievalism was departing, was going, and now new spirit was entering in English mind and life, and that was a modern spirit. Wycliffe was one of the most important literary personality, and he was followed by so many other people during those times who sowed the seeds of this revolt or change or reformation of the whole church and Christianity. So changing were taking place in religion, and these changes were initiated by John Wycliffe. So individualism was much emphasized. The church now was losing its own control over the people, and people got that kind of individual attitude or independence from the orthodoxy of the church authorities. There were so many wars, which is also known as 100 Years War. Okay, so England was fighting war against so many countries, and as a result, the British people, the local people of England, they were now full of nationalism, they were full of patriotism. So the spirit of patriotism, the spirit of nationalism also you can find on political level. The industry was also developing faster during the 14th century, and as a result, there was a rise of the middle classes to the upper classes, right? So the poor were becoming richer, and richer were becoming more richer were becoming the richest. So the lower class people now came on the front, and they got a kind of independent voice in the society. This transition, this change on social, political, and religious level has been very realistically presented by all the poets whom I told you in the beginning. These poets have expressed these changes taking place in their poetry. Say for example, Geoffrey Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales. In this Canterbury Tales, you find the characters like the clerk of Oxford, which represents the spirit of older generation. But if you compare the clerk of Oxford with the wife of Bath, the wife of Bath is a character who represents the new spirit, the modern spirit. So these changes were realistically reflected in the 14th century poetry written by Geoffrey Chaucer, William Langland, and Gower. Second important point to be noted here is the growth of the national sentiment. The kind of, I told you in the beginning, the kind of nationalism, patriotism, love for the country was growing among the people, and that happened because of the 100 Years' War. England, as I told you, was at war with Scotland and France, and England won these wars, and as a result, people were very much enthusiastic, people were full of confidence and confidence of love for the country. This national spirit has also been expressed by major poets of the 14th century. Geoffrey Chaucer has presented this love for the country, the spirit of the love for the country, in the characters like the knight, the squire, and so many. The third important thing to note about this age is Black Death, famine, and social conflict. This age during the 14th century, we witness so many natural calamities and social conflict. Plague and other epidemics, they brought about frustration among the people. Why? Because a large number of people lost their lives in during 1348 to 49. Moreover, 1362, 1367, and 1370, again this plague reappeared in the society in England. Moreover, because of famine, it was very difficult to get employment. So labor was becoming costlier, and the kings, they imposed much taxes on the peasants, on the local farmers living in England, and as a result, there was much conflict between the farmers and the kings, and the feudalism was destroyed by the peasants. So the farmers started revolting against the orthodox government. Number four, there was much corruption. If you examine the condition of religion in those times, church was the supreme power in those times, right? And all the officials who were working in the church, they were highly corrupt people, including the monks, the priests, the saints. Everyone was running after luxury, after wealth, after the creation of wealth. So there was a kind of spirit of materialism found among the church people, and these people were indulged in so many vices including corruption. So corruption was a major trait in religion. John Wycliffe brought about a kind of revolution. He started revolting against these church people who were corrupt people, right? And that is why John Wycliffe has also been termed as the morning star of Reformation. The Reformation, which you find in England during the 16th century, the seeds of this Reformation were sowed by John Wycliffe during the 14th century. And the last important thing to note about this age is the spirit of new learning. The Renaissance, the spirit of Renaissance started in England. Renaissance means what? Renaissance means revival of learning, rebirth of learning. Okay, the 14th century common man had a craze of learning, and their intellectual horizons, they were widening now because of their learning, their quest for learning. This spirit actually came to England from Italy. In Italy, during the same period, 14th century, there were the poets and critics and philosophers like Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio, who had already initiated this spirit of reformation in Italy, which was influencing the British English authors also. And Chaucer was one of them who has expressed this spirit of reformation, this change, this new learning, the spirit of new learning in so many of his characters presented in the Canterbury Tales. Now, after having a look at the social, political, and religious conditions of the 14th century England, now it is the time to understand and to have a look at what kind of English poetry was produced, was written by Chaucer and his company. So, the most important feature of the 14th century poetry is allegory. You know, the poets like Gower, Langland, and Barber, they had presented the stories, okay, in their poetry. Now, these stories were presented in an allegorical manner, in which the first surface story is presented and another one is the hidden story, right, where hidden story releases a deeper meaning than the surface story. That is called allegorical story. See, these allegorical stories were very popular, which were written by Gower, John Gower, William Langland, and John Barber. Another important thing was moralizing. Okay, literature or poetry was used as a tool to reform the society, as a tool to teach some moral lessons to the people of those times. And John Gower was on top of all as far as moral preaching is concerned. Even Geoffrey Chaucer, who was a close friend to John Gower, Chaucer calls him the moral Gower. Right, Gower, he was a reformer. He wanted to bring reformation in the society. There were so many social evils in the society. By writing poetry, he wanted to reform the people. He wanted to teach some moral lessons to the society, and that is why Gower is considered as an important moralist of the 14th century. Apart from Gower, we have William Langland also, who also joined Gower in this movement of the Reformation by using literature, by using poetry as a tool to teach the people. Moreover, realism was also an important feature of the 14th century English poetry. Realism means the poets of this period, they gave realistic picture, exact picture of the society. The social evils were exposed by these people, by these poets. Chaucer was on top of them. Chaucer's realism is unassailable. You cannot compare Chaucer with other poets during the 14th century as far as presentation of society realistically is concerned. Satire is also another important trait of the 14th century poetry. You know, the Chaucer's poetry, Langland's poetry, they are full of humor and satire, right? Chaucer, but there is a difference between Chaucer and Langland. Chaucer's humor, Chaucer's satire is very mild and gentle by nature. But if you examine, if you read the poetry of Langland, here you have fierce, bitter kind of satire in his poetry. Another important thing is storytelling. There was a tradition, the 14th century poetry. If you read all the poets, you find that everyone was telling the stories. Actually, this storytelling tradition came from Italy. In Italy during the 14th century, there was a writer called Boccaccio. Boccaccio wrote stories in Italian language, and Chaucer was influenced by Boccaccio, and Chaucer presented stories in the Canterbury Tales in the form of poetry. In the same manner, other poets like Gower and Langland, they also have presented stories in the poetic form. So storytelling was another important feature. And the last feature of the 14th century poetry was pathos and humor. You know, this pathos, karundras, and humor, hasyarasa, all are both are opposites, right? But both opposite things are very well, beautifully, artistically combined together and presented by the poets of this age. And Chaucer has been acclaimed as the first humorist of English literature. If you read his poetry, the Canterbury Tales, you find so many touches of humor and at the same time touches of pathos in his poetry. Okay, so these were some of the major features of the 14th century poetry. Now let's conclude by saying that Chaucer's age, 14th century, 1350 to 1400, it witnessed two different opposite spirits. What two spirits? The medieval spirit of the old period and the new spirit of the modern period. Okay, so it was a period of transition from change from medievalism to modernism. This period also witnessed so many natural calamities. There was conflict among the people, the poor people and the rich people. There was conflict between the farmers and the kings. Okay, on religious level, the church authorities, they were now losing their own control over the people. Why? Because there was much corruption among the people. So all these social changes were whether political, social or religious, they were realistically expressed by the poets like Geoffrey Chaucer, John Gower, William Langland and John Barber. So this is all I wanted to tell you about the age of Chaucer. Thank you for watching. Thank you very much.